Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Friday, August 7th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, state chief information security officers are getting a bigger seat at the executive table, but many are still waiting for the resources to match their growing responsibilities. Plus, most people don't think about cybersecurity when they turn on the tap, but the same remote connections that help utility operators monitor and maintain critical systems can also create opportunities for cyber attackers. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Trump administration pledged to shift the Federal Emergency Management Agency away from a bloated DC-centric deadweight, but FEMA's regions, not its Washington headquarters, bore the brunt of the workforce cuts that happened without any strategic planning. That's according to the latest Government Accountability Office report on FEMA's workforce challenges. Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now with more details. Justin, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
What were the big findings in this latest report on FEMA?
Well, GAO tallied FEMA's workforce losses over the last 18 months at roughly 4,500 employees, which is in line with kind of what we've been reporting and tallying over the last year and a half. Most of those staff left under the Trump administration's voluntary workforce reduction programs. But what GAO found here specifically for FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security is that they allowed these workforce cuts to happen without evaluating any sort of current or future workforce needs. And those reductions and lack of planning may impact mission readiness at FEMA. You know, FEMA has not had any big disasters to have to respond to, but it's been struggling with workforce shortages dating back to 2017, really, in that big hurricane season. And while it's been a little bit quiet, relatively speaking, lately, FEMA's workforce is kind of at a low over the last decade or so as far as number of employees. And so that's certainly raising some concerns when it comes to the fact that GAO found there wasn't really any thought to getting down to this level.
We all watched these workforce reductions play out really across the government. So what in GAO's report was particularly troubling about how they played out at FEMA?
Well, FEMA, of course, was swept up in these big workforce reductions across the federal government starting last spring. But they had a series of leaders, and they were really in turmoil for the last year plus. First, you had Cameron Hamilton, who has come back around to be the FEMA administrator. He was the acting administrator back in the spring, and he was fired for saying that FEMA should just continue to exist. He was replaced by David Richardson, a senior DHS official who was then performing the duties of the FEMA administrator. And David Richardson rescinded FEMA's strategic plan in May of last year. That was really the guiding light for how FEMA evaluates all of its needs, including workforce. I spoke with Chris Curry, who is GAO's Director of Homeland Security Issues, about kind of what effect that had on FEMA's workforce planning.
FEMA kind of threw out all of its workforce planning principles that it had been using for years. And these principles were designed to make sure it's ready to respond to what happens in the country if there's multiple events. It made these reductions basically without thinking about what they needed or who they needed. Recently, FEMA has actually started this hurricane season, was actually hiring again to fill critical needs. I'm not sure what good it does you to get rid of a lot of people without thinking about it, only to have to hire people back because you need them.
You mentioned, Justin, that these hit the FEMA regions particularly hard. What did GAO find there?
Yeah, this caught my eye because I think if you've been following FEMA closely, you kind of aren't surprised by that top line GAO finding while still being very important. But it did seem like FEMA just kind of shed staff very quickly and randomly over the last year. But what was new here with the GAO report was this breakout of how these reductions happened across FEMA's regions. It splits up the country into different regional directorates that really spearhead any sort of response to disasters in those regions. And most of the regions saw a loss percentage of 9% or more between January 20th, 2025 and January 10th, 2026. That was the deadline for folks to go through those voluntary workforce reduction programs. For instance, Region 10 up in the Pacific Northwest, where these wildfires are happening right now, they saw 10% of their workforce depart. Down in California in Region 9, and kind of the western region there, 13% of that region's workforce departed. And then you swing over to the Southeast, Florida, and the southeastern United States, where, of course, hurricanes from the Atlantic are primed to kind of hit. They lost 10% of their regional workforce there. FEMA headquarters, while being by far and away the biggest kind of component of FEMA compared to the regions, it just saw a 5% reduction in its staffing, which is significant, but certainly percentage-wise, not nearly as significant as what those regions saw. And this is interesting because the Trump administration pledged to kind of drain the swamp with FEMA specifically. It was a frequent line under former Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, and that's not what happened here.
And we heard Chris Curry say up at the top of the conversation here that FEMA is beginning to rehire. Where are they going next with rebuilding the workforce? Do they have a new strategic hiring plan in place?
Not yet, but that could be coming soon, because what FEMA told GAO as part of this report is that they will start working on a new strategic plan once a confirmed FEMA administrator is in place. And then that will lead to a new workforce analysis. And FEMA is on the cusp of getting that Senate confirmed administrator. Cameron Hamilton is expected to be included in this batch of nominees that the Senate votes through before leaving town for August recess. So they could have a FEMA administrator in place very, very soon. And they could start working more on some of these workforce challenges, as Chris Curry mentioned, with the hiring that's now started. But, these things take time. And I think, to Chris Curry's point, disasters don't wait. Here's what he said about that.
Last year was the first year in many years we did not have a large landfalling hurricane. So luckily, we didn't have to see what FEMA's response to that would have been with all these reductions. However, we're not going to get lucky like that every year. And I think that's my biggest concern.
And again, that's Chris Curry, GAO's Director of Homeland Security Issues.
Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for getting us up to speed on this.
Sounds good. Thank you, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, state chief information security officers are getting a bigger seat at the executive table, but many are still waiting for the resources to match their growing responsibilities. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. State Chief Information Security Officers have more responsibilities than ever. A new survey from the National Association of State CIOs and Deloitte finds state CISOs are facing growing demands that are not being matched by more resources. For more on how state CISOs are dealing with more work and tightening budgets, Federal News Network's executive editor Jason Miller talked with Meredith Ward, the deputy executive director of the National Association of State CIOs, and Mike Wyatt, the state, local, and higher education cyber risk leader for Deloitte.
CISOs are involved. They're at the table. They are involved in policy. They're involved in acceptable use and safe use. That's really good. But I said there was really bad headlines. I'll tell you what that is. Might as well just be transparent about that. So CISO confidence is way down in a lot of things. So CISO confidence in the cyber practices of local governments, the cyber practices of third parties. And so, and again, with them being able to combat AI-enabled threats. So a lot of times I like to describe the state CISO job as almost like playing a game of whack-a-mole. If anyone else is old and remembers playing that it's like, what's going to come up next? It's just a constant, not knowing.
Meredith, one of the things that absolutely stood out, and I know you alluded to this earlier, is the drop in confidence that CISOs have in how well the states are protected. And I think it's just a reflection not only of the increased use of AI by adversaries, but also the budget constraints. This is a first year we've actually seen budgets go down in a while. And so I think that you've got a perfect storm, if you will, of budget pressure, the ongoing challenges of staffing, increased threat landscape and threat actors. It is a difficult time for CISOs to provide that level of protection that is needed by state, local, and higher education institutions these days.
Mike, I have to say it. I got to throw in. And every time I talk to state legislators or funders, I get asked all the time, when is this whole cyber thing going to be over?
Yes.
And I say,
when are we
yeah,
going to be done?
right. When are we going to be done? And my kind of answer is, well, when you don't hear of any threats, you don't see anything in the news, you don't see pipelines being attacked or water sources being attacked or schools being attacked, then you come and you tell me. And then that's maybe when we'll be done. So it is very daunting. And I understand that, for funders and other leaders in state governments and other governments, it is exhausting. And so as long as the bad guys, the bad actors are out there, as long as they keep thinking of stuff, the funding and support is going to need to be there.
I have to say, Meredith, I am so surprised that here we are in 2026. You're still getting the question of when this cyber thing is going to be over. I thought we had gotten past that. I thought we've gotten to the point now where we all at least have some recognition that cybersecurity is a challenge, that we've all lost our data somewhere in a cyber breach. Like, I thought that was common, kind of knowledge that the cybersecurity thing is important. I know you didn't touch upon this in the survey, but is that part of the reason why maybe there's some doom and gloom because we're still not at the understanding point that we think we should be?
And this is a time where I will say NASCIO's favorite quote: if you've seen one state, you've seen one state. So in some states, it's really great. And in other states, there's a little bit more of a learning curve, right? And that is due to just a ton of different things. So it's more of, why is this so expensive? Because right now we have not only the cost of technology that is more expensive, everyone's experienced that, but the cost to remediate cybersecurity or respond to an incident is very expensive. It is cheaper to prevent, and that's what we keep trying to tell folks. So I think it's a sense of exhaustion all the way around. And we get that, and our CISOs get that too, right? And it's also you can't just have one thing in place. That's not going to solve everything. I tell everyone, cyber, it's like a toolbox. You have a ton of different things in your toolbox. And if anybody says, if you get this one thing, you're going to be completely safe, that's not true. So I think it is daunting. That's the word that I would use.
Mike, I'd love to just get you to weigh in on that as well. Did you get a sense when you talk to clients across different states that there's some obviously who get it more than others, but are we still, in some cases, in the very early stages of understanding why cybersecurity is important?
I'm happy to report that there are states that have committed to improving and providing a really good security posture for their constituents. States like Texas with the investment in Texas Cyber Command. And I would like to note that the funding was provided by the state legislature without a dependency on federal dollars. There's a lot of ambiguity, shall we say, on federal funding these days. And so other states are looking at what Texas is doing, and some states are moving out with new legislation, new funding to take responsibility to provide that whole of state cybersecurity posture that is clearly needed in today's world.
Let's go back to one thing that Meredith said and drill a little deeper into it. The expanded responsibilities for state CISOs. Not so surprising, but maybe even good to hear. Meredith, you talked about some gloom and doom earlier. That maybe is more a positive sign that not only they are at the table, but as AI gets rolled out, the CISOs have a bigger say, a bigger way to participate, to do it in the right way, in a safe and secure way. Talk a little bit about what the survey told you about those expanded roles.
You mentioned this whole state. That's what we really should kind of drill down on. And I think it's what I said at the beginning, that bad actors, I always say the bad guys, but I don't want to be sexist because there could be female cyber criminals out there. It's equal, we're equal opportunity, but the bad actors, they don't care where border lines are. They don't care where state lines are. They don't care where local lines are. So, this concept of whole of state is cyber is everyone's responsibility, public sector, private sector, healthcare, education, all of that. So we are seeing CISOs take on a greater role and responsibility with that, even if many CISOs will tell you, I don't have the authority to take over, nor do they want to for local governments. And they may or may not have the funding. There's states like Texas that have funded it. Utah has gotten funding. Massachusetts has gotten funding for training, things like that. So that's where I see a lot of this coming from, increased CISO responsibility. The other thing that really stands out in my mind, we've talked about AI, and I think with AI, that attack surface just keeps on expanding. And then, the other thing really is if you look at a procurement, a project, or whatever in states and feds and local government, it almost always is going to have a technology component. There's hardly anything these days, even if you're looking at inventory, right, that perhaps people would do via, by paper. These days, there's a technology component. So there's a big discussion in what is a technology project. If it has a technology component, it therefore then has a cyber component. So I think things just continue to explode on that.
One of the other things is we're seeing an increased sophistication with how CISOs are communicating to stakeholders, including the legislature, about cyber risk. The successful CISOs tend to communicate in enterprise risk terms and impact to mission, as opposed to using highly technical talk, which, especially for legislators, you'll see eyes glaze over. If you bring it back to mission continuity and the criticality of being able to provide constituent services, there tends to be more receptivity to making the investments necessary to improve the security posture of the state.
Meredith Ward is the Deputy Executive Director of the National Association of State CIOs, and Mike Wyatt is the State, Local, and Higher Education Cyber Risk Leader for Deloitte. You can find more of their conversation with Federal News Network's Executive Editor Jason Miller at federalnewsnetwork.com. Search Ask the CIO. Still to come, some contractors got CMMC certified early, investing before they had to. Now that implementation is on hold, and they're asking whether moving first still pays. But first, most people don't think about cybersecurity when they turn on the water tap, but the same remote connections that help utility operators monitor and maintain critical systems can also create opportunities for cyber attackers. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Keeping water systems running requires remote access for monitoring, maintenance, and vendor support. Securing those connections has become a growing priority for utilities that rely on operational technology every day. A new NIST guide offers practical approaches for doing exactly that. And here to discuss it is Chi Tang, an electronic engineer at NIST. Mr. Tang, thanks so much for joining me today. It's great to have you on the show.
I'm happy to be here.
We're going to talk about cybersecurity, and when we do that, generally, I think people think about cybersecurity and data or computers. You've got a new report out, though, that focuses on operational technology, specifically ones that move and treat water. Why is OT security such a different challenge?
Well, OT technology work in a different environment. So safety, reliability, often under unique operating environment. So all of those factors are important to work for an OT environment. For example, for the water and wastewater system. So that makes a tremendous difference than the IT system. The OT system require a lot different attention because of the system behave differently or work differently than a pure IT system. That's why OT has a big challenge. For example, the OT system could be a very long lifetime. It could be like 15, 20 or even more that the equipment can last that long. So to address those systems, we require very specific security measures to do that.
Your report specifically focuses on remote access for operational technology. Why did you identify that as such an immediate high priority issue for the water sector?
Well, based on our survey to the industry and some of our research work, we identify a few things. For example, network asset management, network segmentation, and remote access, they are all important. But all of those, it appears to us that remote access is the top priority of many respondents on the survey and the industry concern. That's why we start with that.
And what are the threats to the water system specifically that you're worried about?
Well, for the remote access, we worry about like unauthorized access to the remote sites of the water system. Some of those remote sites are unmanned, and they do have the control equipment, and they do have the ability to disrupt the operating of the water system. So, if an unauthorized intruder hack into those systems, they could have the potential to disrupt the normal operation and also may cause a system failure.
I suspect that the average person only thinks about water when they turn on the tap or when they buy a bottle at the store. So when you think about this operational technology and remote access for maintenance and monitoring and vendor support, how does it create that opportunity for unauthorized access that you're just talking about?
So, like you said, the maintenance, like the maintenance and the support, they are huge efficiency enhancer. So people can remotely access some of the equipment, and they don't have to physically go there. So it helps increase the operation efficiency. But on the exact opposite side, if you have people like with a bad intention trying to through the same channel get into those equipment, then they may have the ability to do some bad impact to the system. They could disrupt and stop the water. They could potentially change the content of the water system. So those are the things that we worry that will be impacting the normal operation and the safe delivery of drinking water and treatment of wastewater.
Even though clean water is certainly a public asset, many of the water plants and utilities are contractor operated, if not privately owned. How does that change the risk profile here?
Well, to our knowledge, that many of them, they are different sizes of operation. So it could be, like you said, it could be the operator operating it. It could be a contractor operating it. So the water sector has a wide variety of different operation in terms of size and operation and expertise in the cybersecurity sense of in that manner. So that create a problem is we saw that a larger capability water system, they may have the resources and the knowledge to defend their system. But we also see that a lot of smaller capability water system, they may not have that expertise. So that may create a problem that some of the system are more vulnerable than the others.
Chi Tang is an electronic engineer at NIST. So Chi, let's follow on with what you were just talking about, different sizes of operations, different staffs, different budgets. How did that reality shape the architectures and solutions that NIST chose to demonstrate here?
So in our publication, we developed 3 different reference architecture. The intention is to showcase a different way to protect your system. One of them is more classic. The other one is more using based on cloud computing. That will give the advantage of for a smaller scale system that may be able to take advantage of that. That require a little less expertise and have a more budget-friendly entry cost, so that they can still have a secure remote access, but they do have a little bit more flexibility and scalability on the deployment.
If you were a utility manager listening today and you could only do one thing to improve the security of your water treatment plant, looking at this article, what would you hope that they would do first?
That's a hard question, Terry. That's the hard is not because of like what the technology can do, but hard is like you only can pick one thing, right? So security, as often as you know, security comes as a package, and any weak link may be exploited by the malicious actor. So we try to have a whole package that make this whole system secure. Now, but if I have to pick that one thing, I think is to strengthen your authentication or access control to your remote access site. so that you have a stronger authentication scheme and also combined with a stronger access control so that you can more protect in that way. Now that doesn't mean that solve all your problem, as I have to re-emphasize that there's a whole package. But if you have to do something, you have to pick, I think that is something, authentication and access control is something you want to consider.
Oftentimes when I ask that weakest link question, I get a technology answer. And many times we find out that, in fact, the people in the system are the weakest link. What are you seeing as the best training or preparation for the humans in this loop to help prevent malicious access?
That's a very good observation. As we say to protect the whole system, technology only play a part of it. So the policy, so the organization governance and the whole training and the policy environment does do the whole thing. So as you said, like it is a human operating system. So all the control system, all the equipment and automation is only helping the human to do their job more efficiently. So the training and the policy of the organization does play an important role in how to protect the overall security.
And your guide says that these concepts apply beyond water utilities to OT environments more generally. What lessons should federal agencies and other critical infrastructure operators take from this work and apply in different situations?
So many critical infrastructure operators, they have very similar challenge and very similar operating environment. So we think that the lesson we develop or the lesson we learn or the reference architecture we develop in this publication, it could be used by other sectors, at least in the high level and architecture level. You may have to modify a little bit in the detail on how you deploy it, but in the general concept, in the general like how you secure the remote access, we think that's a good example for the other sector to consider.
Chi Tang is an electronic engineer at NIST. Thank you so much for your time today and for this really helpful reference.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, some contractors got CMMC certified early, investing before they had to. Now that implementation is on hold and they're asking whether moving first still pays. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Government often relies on industry to invest ahead of future requirements. The recent pause in CMMC implementation is raising questions about how contractors weigh risk, cost, and the value of moving first. Here with one company's perspective are Angie Leinert and Jeremiah Jensen of Intelligenesis. Angie and Jeremiah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Terry. We're glad to be here.
Angie, you at Intelligenesis made the decision to pursue CMMC Level 2 certification before it was required. That's certainly a topic of interest these days. Why did you decide to move early rather than wait and see?
We decided to move early because we were starting to see some of the CMMC requirements language coming out in some of the most recent contract solicitations. And we realized at that point that we don't anticipate any changes. We do see that the government is going to move forward with their plans, and we want to make sure that we are going to be in the position to be awarded some of those contracts. And in order to ensure that availability of reward, we need to go ahead and with the steps and secure our CMMC Level 2 certification. So we did.
So you viewed it as a source of competitive advantage.
Not only competitive advantage, I mean, really out of necessity. If the government is mandating this is a requirement for you, for contractors to be able to perform and win awards, to be able to do the work that we've been doing for the past 19 years, that as other requirements, we have to make sure that those requirements are satisfied. And we also, as a small business, started to see with some of our other larger partners they were pushing the requirements down a lot earlier, trying to make sure that the small businesses were going through with the certifications. And if not, I don't want to say threatening, but that's the word I'm going to use, threatening to remove the businesses from the team and from the work. So again, it was out of necessity that we moved forward and went ahead and made the huge investment to make sure that we were going to be compliant and be able to be eligible for this work.
Jeremiah, Angie's just called this a huge investment. There have been a lot of concerns about exactly how heavy of a lift this is for small businesses. You were in charge of it. What did the certification actually require in terms of time and effort and resources?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, the time, effort, resources, it was pretty intense to take the company and looking at all the requirements that we had to answer. I ended up working with our technical team. Of course, they understand how to put together all the technical documentation, secure our infrastructure, and do the patching and everything. But one of the things that we really had to look at was our documentation. We had to update a SSP. We had to basically write over 50 documents in order to kind of support all these policies and processes that they were calling for within CMMC. So it was a huge effort of trying to get the requirements and kind of taking a lift off of the technical folks so they could work on kind of doing the updates and making sure we were moving all our CUI information into the GCC High, while on the other side, we ended up writing the backbone, kind of the documentation in order to kind of support everything. So we had 4 months in order to really kind of put this together. And I mean, the team was working 7 days a week on it to try to get this to the finish line.
Angie, when given the level of work and the level of investment that Jeremiah has just described, when DoD suspended the phase 2 requirements, what was your immediate reaction?
Let me see. Let me clean that up a little bit. I was very frustrated at the decision because, again, this is something that they've been talking about for a very long time. We, Intelligenesis, as well as other companies, have mentioned some of the concerns we have. I mean, let me be clear. We are a cybersecurity company. We understand the risk associated with companies not being protected and the supply chain and all the risks that are associated with that. That is what we do. We understand it completely. But the CMMC is a lot more involved than just cybersecurity. I mean, as Jeremiah mentioned, there's all the policies that have to be addressed, the documentation. It's typical, I don't want to say bureaucracy, but a lot of the policies that govern it that are necessary to have a baseline, but don't necessarily guarantee that cybersecurity. But it is a step in the right direction, right? It is a very heavy lift, though. So for us, I mean, that we invested, including our own team's time, a few $100,000. I mean, over 200,000 to be a little more specific. And for a small business, that's significant. So I was very frustrated that 200 plus $1,000 and all the amount of time that the team spent on that could have been used in other areas of the company. That time that we spent with the CMMC, instead of the 7 days a week for months at a time, could have been used winning other work, building new technologies in other areas. So it was very frustrating and disappointing, to say the least.
Angie Leinert is owner, president, and CEO of Intelligenesis, and Jeremiah Jensen is their COO. Angie, let me just follow up. The companies that waited to pursue CMMC avoided the cost and the uncertainty that you're dealing with now. What lessons do you worry that industry is taking from this experience?
Well, I'm very worried that this is going to cause future delays and problems for any kind of policy that's going to be rolled out or mandate. Why should we believe that we actually have to do it, even when we're seeing it in the solicitations, if we know that all of a sudden it can just change or it can be delayed? Again, there are no grants. There are very limited resources, vendors, auditors that are available for this. And to think that we just went through this and had to pay all this money out. There's no tax credits. Again, I mean, this is just money out the door and this time that's wasted. So honestly, what will happen next time? I and probably many other companies will wait. We will probably wait and let that deadline pass and then worry about it. Because again, that is time, resources, money, investments that could have been placed in other areas of the business that are now just for what?
The NIST standards have been around for a while here, the standards that CMMC is based on. What's your take on the approach that may come out of this, which is companies still continue to self-attest that they're compliant with those NIST standards?
Yeah, so I mean, that's been going on for a while. We've been self-attesting to CMMC and going forward. And it takes a lot of the paperwork and the kind of the burden of going to that next level where we really had to kind of do all the paperwork and put that in place. So I think the self-attestation as they're moving through it, I think that's a good starting point. But going to the next level, I mean, if they're going to look at adding this into the contracts and stuff, having that next layer at the level, but then you got to realize all this paperwork and all the processes are going to come at when you go up to the next level.
Angie, as the owner of the company, how do you feel about the risks that you take on with that self-attestation approach?
It's a great question. And I was actually wanting to say something about that. Again, we're a cybersecurity company, so we understand the risk associated. We make sure that we are already protected and we are very good at what we do. The concern that I have, and that with NIST, and I know it's been around for a while, that self-attestation, some people, I mean, there's no auditing of that. There's no guarantee that people are even doing it other than signing a piece of paper. Yeah, my network's good. Yeah, we're good to go. I mean, that's the whole point and the principle behind having these different certifications is to make sure that somebody is coming in behind you and making sure that, yes, your network actually is safe. Yes, you are secure enough to be able to handle these government contracts. I mean, having the NIST requirements for companies that take it seriously, that's great, but how many of them are there really that do that? And how can we verify that they are doing it correctly unless there is this other layer? And so honestly, it's terrifying.
And so what do you wish or hope that DoD does differently as a result of this 60-day review that they're conducting now?
Well, I hope that they realize that this requirement's been out there for a few years now. So this is kind of late in the game. If people are complaining about it, that's too bad. They need to move forward with the requirement and the deadlines they set. Don't set a deadline and make contractors adhere to it if you're not going to follow through with it. So you set a deadline, stick to what you've done, and everybody else, they're either going to have to catch up or they're not going to do business with the government.
Do you see future challenges in the market, especially for small businesses, if the requirement continues as a certification requirement and primes continue to have to force the compliance standards down through their supply chains?
I do. I think that it's important. I think as a small business, there should be some other kind of resources or something available because the pricing, again, it doesn't seem to be controlled. So there's only a few companies that can perform these services so that the prices are outrageous. I'd really like to see some kind of interference or involvement from the government to try to help lower some of those costs so small businesses can feel comfortable with the service that they're receiving and also be able to afford it or have some type of tax credits associated with it. Just some way to kind of help reduce that cost that is required for the small businesses. That would be ideal.
Angie Leinert is owner, president, and CEO of Intelligenesis, and Jeremiah Jensen is her COO. Thank you both for joining me and especially for sharing your experiences with us today.
Thank you, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Up next, the top national headlines from ABC News and the Federal Newscast. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.
And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Friday, August 7th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, state chief information security officers are getting a bigger seat at the executive table, but many are still waiting for the resources that match their growing responsibilities. Plus, most people don't think about cybersecurity when they turn on the water tap, but the same remote connections that help utility operators monitor and maintain critical systems can also create opportunities for cyber attackers. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Pentagon's Independent Weapons Testing Office has pulled decades of unclassified annual reports from its public website, arguing that artificial intelligence would allow foreign adversaries to combine publicly available information into detailed assessments of U.S. military vulnerabilities. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis joins me now with more details. Anastasia, great to have you.
Hi, Terry.
This is a really interesting development. What kind of information is in these reports?
These annual reports are kind of one of the most important elements and why the office was created 4 decades ago, which is to provide Congress and the public information about whether a weapon system works effectively in an operational environment and whether there are any safety issues with that system. DoD took down these reports in July. Their justification was that in today's information environment, open source databases, tools like automated data aggregation and AI, they're being exploited by foreign adversaries, and they're being used to compile, quote, disparate unclassified data points into highly detailed vulnerability profiles targeting U.S. critical infrastructure and defense capabilities. So I asked the Defense Department whether the decision to remove these reports was in response to something, whether something happened, whether DoD identified instances where the reports were used in this way, and they said this was a proactive measure and it was designed to strengthen its security posture.
Why are these reports so important to Congress and the public? What do they use them for?
So these reports have long been one of the few independent assessments of whether major weapon systems actually perform as promised. Congress created this office after several very high-profile weapons failures that cost service members' lives. So Congress and the public now have kind of access to this objective information on the results and implications of operational testing of each major acquisition program. The office over the last 4 decades has faced a lot of challenges, not surprisingly, both from the military services and from the defense industry, because it provides an independent assessment of whether weapons systems actually work. There's usually a classified version of this report that DoD has, but it's also required. But DoD is required to provide an unclassified report to Congress and publish it on its website.
That requirement for an annual unclassified report's been around for a while. So if this is a new problem, how does the office plan to comply with that statutory obligation?
Yeah, what they told me is that they will continue to meet its Title X statutory requirement, and I quote, in a manner that will ensure its information is properly protected. However, like I mentioned, the office, is legally required to submit their annual report in a form that is unclassified and that doesn't require safeguarding or dissemination control, which just means that there can be restrictions or information and it shouldn't be marked as controlled unclassified information or something like for official use only or have any other restrictions. But there is also another law that requires the Defense Department to make reports that it provides, that it submits to Congress, available on its website. So there have been attempts to restrict this information provided to Congress in the past. However, there has never been a time where DoD just doesn't provide a public unclassified version.
What are you hearing from members of Congress on this approach? Are they saying that it's acceptable?
DoD said that the office's director, Amy Henninger, she made the decision, and they pointed to her expertise in adversarial and counter AI technologies. And at least one senator, Elizabeth Warren, she said that hiding these reports would cost service members' lives. It would waste billions of dollars. And it also raises questions about whether Dr. Henninger intentionally misled Congress. And what Warren refers to, or what Warren was referring to, was their exchange during Henninger's confirmation hearing, where Warren asked her whether she would continue providing the public with reports that were as complete and unrestricted as possible. Here's their exchange.
One of your major tools is your annual report. Under the Biden administration, there was pressure on the testing office to hide problems through designations like controlled unclassified information. The information isn't classified, but those blank spots, blackouts in the report, keep the public in the dark about a tank that gets so hot that it burns soldiers' hands, or the risk that a pilot ejecting from an F-35 will have their neck snapped. So, Dr. Henninger, if you are confirmed, do you promise to ensure that the testing office's reports inform the public as much as possible about the problems that we need to fix in order to make sure that our weapons are safe?
Yes, Senator, to the maximum extent possible.
Okay, I will hold you to that.
Anastasia, it sounds like there are more conversations to come then.
Oh, absolutely. I asked Warren's office if she plans to seek additional information from DoD about this decision. They said they can't share anything on oversight as of right now, but I think it's a big issue that they pulled these reports, but you can still find them. The question is what's going to happen from now on.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Thanks for bringing us the story.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, state chief information security officers are getting a bigger seat at the executive table, but many are still waiting for the resources to match their growing responsibilities. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.